The mansion at 14 Ravenswood Drive was the kind of place that made people slow their cars on Sunday afternoons just to steal a glance through the iron gates. 12 bedrooms. A pool that shimmered like liquid sapphire in the California sun. A wine cellar that held bottles worth more than most Americans earned in a year. And at its center, ruling it all with the quiet, efficient authority of a man who had built his empire with nothing but a laptop, a borrowed desk in his college dorm, and a terrifying refusal to quit, lived Nathaniel James Calloway. Nate, as his few close friends called him, had turned 33 in November. His software company, Calloway Digital, had just crossed a valuation of $4.7 billion, a number so large it had stopped feeling real to him somewhere around the $2 billion mark. Forbes had called him the most quietly dangerous mind in Silicon Valley. Business Insider had named him one of the 30 most influential people under 40. His face had been on magazine covers, his name whispered in boardrooms from San Francisco to Singapore. None of it meant much to him before 8 o'clock in the morning. Before coffee, Nate Calloway was simply a tired man. He moved through his enormous house in old gray sweatpants and a faded MIT hoodie that he'd owned since sophomore year. He padded barefoot on cold marble floors. He forgot where he left his phone. He burned toast. He was, in those quiet early hours, utterly and completely human, a fact that his staff understood well and guarded carefully, because the press version of Nate Calloway had no room for burned toast or misplaced keys. The household staff numbered 6. There was George, the 62-year-old groundskeeper who had worked the property since before Nate bought it and who treated every rosebush like a personal responsibility. There was Mrs. Hendricks, the cook, a formidable woman from New Orleans who believed firmly that butter solved most of life's problems. There were 2 security personnel, who rotated shifts. There was Paolo, the driver, who read philosophy audiobooks during his downtime and was working on his master's degree online. And there was Maria Elena Vasquez, the head housekeeper, who had joined the household 8 months ago. Maria was 28 years old, though she carried herself with a quiet steadiness that sometimes made her seem older. She was compact and quick, with dark eyes that missed very little, and hands that were always moving, straightening, polishing, arranging. She spoke English with a soft accent that still tilted occasionally toward the Spanish of her childhood in San Antonio. She had grown up hard. She had learned early that the world did not offer much to girls who grew up hard, and she had responded to that lesson not with bitterness, but with an almost ferocious work ethic that had impressed every employer she'd ever had. She was, by every measure Nate had observed in his 8 months of brief morning encounters with her, exceptional at her job. What Nate did not know, what he had never thought to ask, because in the organized, compartmentalized life of a billionaire there were things you simply didn't think to ask, was that Maria Elena Vasquez was also a mother. Her daughter's name was Sophia. Sophia Rose Vasquez. 3 years old. 28 inches of pure, concentrated life, wide brown eyes, 2 uneven pigtails that Maria redid every single morning, a laugh that sounded like bells dropped on a kitchen floor, and an attachment to a small stuffed elephant named Peanut that was absolute and non-negotiable. Sophia did not go to daycare. Maria could not afford the good ones, and the ones she could afford frightened her in ways she couldn't fully articulate to anyone. So Sophia came to work with her mother, tucked away in the small staff utility room off the East Wing, a room used mostly for storing extra linens and cleaning supplies. It was warm. It had a corner. Maria had quietly arranged a little nest there, a folded moving blanket, a small pillow. Sophia's favorite board books fanned out like a little library. While Maria worked the long morning hours, Sophia stayed in that corner with Peanut and her books and the small tablet Maria paid $12 a month for so her daughter could watch Bluey episodes with the volume kept very, very low. It was an arrangement built entirely on invisibility. Maria arrived before anyone else stirred. She settled Sophia in the utility room. She worked with the speed and precision of someone who knew that every minute mattered, who understood that the entire architecture of her life rested on no one finding out. She had done this for 8 months without incident. 8 months of early alarms and quiet arrivals and careful invisibility. She had almost begun to believe it would work indefinitely. The morning everything changed was a Tuesday in March. Nate had been in Chicago for a 4-day conference that ended a day early. A last-minute decision made at 11 p.m. when the final panel was canceled, and he realized he was exhausted in a way that no hotel minibar and no business dinner conversation could touch. He texted Paolo, booked a red-eye, and landed at LAX at 5:45 in the morning, moving through the airport with the particular invisible speed of a man who has learned to travel without being noticed.
He was home by 7.
The house was quiet. Maria's car was in the staff lot. He noticed it automatically, the way he noticed everything, a habit of attention that had served him well in business and made him occasionally exhausting in personal relationships. He let himself in through the side entrance rather than the main door because he didn't want to trigger the security system announcement and wake anyone unnecessarily. He moved through the kitchen. He found the coffee maker and stood there, waiting, in the particular stupefied silence of a man who has not slept properly in 4 days and has spent 72 hours being impressive at people. He was not looking for anything. He was simply moving through his own house, following the gravitational pull of habit, when he turned down the east hallway toward his home office to drop his laptop bag before the coffee finished brewing. The door to the utility room was not fully closed. That was the only reason he saw it at all, a sliver of warm light falling in a thin line across the hallway floor. He wouldn't have stopped. He would have walked right past, laptop bag on his shoulder, mind already halfway into the day's email backlog. But he heard something. A small sound. Barely there. Like the world holding its breath and then releasing it.
He stopped.
He stood in the hallway of his 12-bedroom, $4.7 billion mansion, and he pushed open the utility room door with 2 fingers, and the morning light fell inside. On a folded moving blanket, in the corner between the shelf of extra pillowcases and a rack of cleaning supplies, curled around a small stuffed elephant with the complete and boneless abandon of a child in deep sleep, was the smallest person he had ever seen in his house. 3 years old. 2 uneven pigtails. A little mouth that was slightly open. And Nathaniel James Calloway, who had negotiated with heads of companies and spoken before crowds of thousands and never, not once, been at a loss in a boardroom in his life, stood in the doorway of his own utility room and felt something in his chest crack open like a window in spring. Maria discovered that he had returned home at 7:14 in the morning. She had been in the main hallway on the 2nd floor, running a microfiber cloth along the baseboard beneath the window seat, a detail most housekeepers skipped, which was precisely why Maria didn't, when she heard the soft click of a door somewhere below her.
She paused.
She counted the sounds. Footsteps on marble. The particular creak of the east hallway floorboard that she had catalogued months ago. And then silence where there should have been continued movement, a silence that had a shape to it, a weight, the specific stillness of someone who has stopped because something has surprised them. She knew before she even straightened up. She knew the way you know a thing that you have been quietly dreading for 8 months, not with surprise but with a cold, rushing recognition. The moment she had managed so carefully, constructed such elaborate defenses against, had arrived anyway. Because moments like this always did. Because the universe, in Maria's experience, had a very particular sense of humor about the things you worked hardest to prevent. She set the microfiber cloth down on the window seat. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs for exactly 3 seconds, a private steadying ritual she'd developed sometime during the worst year of her life. And then she walked down the stairs. Maria Elena Vasquez had known hard things. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself, even if she could never be clear about it to anyone in this house. She had grown up as the 2nd oldest of 5 children in a 2-bedroom apartment in San Antonio, Texas. Her father, Rodrigo, had worked construction until his knee gave out when Maria was 11, and after that the family had reorganized itself around survival in ways that reshaped every one of them. Her mother, Carmen, cleaned office buildings from 4 in the afternoon until midnight and came home smelling of industrial lemon cleaner, still managing to leave school lunches prepared on the counter before she fell into bed. Maria had learned to cook at 9, to manage a household budget at 12, to translate at parent-teacher conferences because her parents' English frayed badly under pressure. She had learned that love was not something you declared so much as demonstrated, through packed lunches and ironed school uniforms and staying up past midnight to help her younger sister with a history project even when her own homework wasn't finished. She had been a good student despite everything. She had a mind that organized information naturally, that found patterns where others saw chaos, that remembered details with a precision that her high school teachers had found remarkable and that she herself simply considered necessary. She had gotten a partial scholarship to a state school for business administration. She had worked 2 jobs during college. She had graduated. And then she had met Daniel. She didn't allow herself to spend much time on Daniel anymore. She had processed what needed to be processed in the particular way that single mothers of young children process difficult things. In the car, usually after drop-offs that no longer existed because there was no drop-off in the 7 minutes between Sophia falling asleep and Maria's own exhaustion pulling her under. She had loved him. He had not been capable of what love actually required. He had left when Sophia was 4 months old, and she had arrived at this conclusion slowly, painfully, and then with something almost like relief, probably better than the alternative of staying and leaving in pieces. She was raising Sophia alone. That was the whole sentence. There was no second half to soften it. Her own mother helped when she could, but Carmen was 61 now and her feet hurt, and she was still cleaning office buildings 3 nights a week because retirement was a concept that existed for other people. Maria's sister Lucia lived in Denver. Her brother Mateo was in the army. The support network was a real thing, made of real love, but it was stretched thin across too many miles and too many obligations to catch everything that needed catching. The job at Ravenswood Drive had come through a domestic staffing agency that a friend of a friend had recommended. The pay was better than anything Maria had found elsewhere. Mr. Calloway's household manager had offered a rate that made Maria go very still for a moment when she heard it, the way you go still when something seems too good, when your whole life has trained you to look for the catch. The catch, she had decided, was the hours. Early start. Some flexibility, but fundamentally long days. The commute from her apartment was 40 minutes each way. She had done the math 14 different ways. She had called every daycare center in a reasonable radius. She had calculated what remained after daycare costs were subtracted from the offered salary and found a number that was survivable but frightening. She had calculated what remained if she solved the daycare problem another way and found a number that was actually livable. The other way was Sophia in the utility room. It was not a decision she had made lightly or without shame. She had lain awake the night before her first day on the job, staring at the ceiling of her apartment while Sophia slept in her toddler bed across the room, and she had conducted an honest inventory of her options. There were none better. This was the one that kept the lights on and Sophia fed and the car running. This was the one that, on paper, made sense. She had told herself it was temporary. 8 months ago, she had believed that. She was still telling herself. It had started feeling more like prayer than planning. She reached the bottom of the stairs. She turned down the east hallway. Nate Calloway was standing in the doorway of the utility room. He had not gone in. He was just standing there with his laptop bag still on his shoulder, and his back was to her, and she could not see his face. She could see Sophia's small form on the blanket, still asleep, peanut tucked under her arm, completely unaware that the entire carefully balanced world her mother had constructed was in the process of coming undone. Mr. Calloway. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. She was absolutely terrified, and her voice came out steady because Maria Vasquez had spent 28 years practicing the art of letting nothing in her voice reveal what was happening in her chest. He turned around. His expression was not what she had prepared for. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for cold, professional disappointment, the clipped tones of a powerful man explaining to someone far beneath him on the economic ladder exactly why what they had done was unacceptable. She had prepared for immediate termination, had already begun the rapid mental calculation of how many weeks her savings would last, what she would tell Sophia, whether her mother could take them in temporarily. She had not prepared for the look on Nathaniel Calloway's face, which was open and unguarded in a way that she suspected he almost never let anyone see. "How old?" he asked, quietly, as if they were in a library. Maria blinked.
3, she said.
He looked back at the sleeping child for a long moment. "How long has she been coming here with you?" 8 months. She kept her voice level. "Mr. Calloway, I understand if." "What's her name?" The question stopped her.
"Sophia," she said.
He nodded slowly. He turned back to look at Maria then, fully, and his expression was doing something complicated that she didn't entirely know how to read. There was something there that looked, improbably, like it might be recognition. As if what he was seeing in the doorway of his own utility room had reached through whatever distance existed between his world and hers and touched something specific and private in him. "Does she take a nap?" he asked. "Around midday?" Maria stared at him. "Yes," she said carefully. "Around noon. Usually about 90 minutes. He nodded again. He adjusted his laptop bag on his shoulder. And then he said 5 words that Maria Elena Vasquez would replay in her mind for years afterward, in the way you replay the precise moment your life quietly pivoted on its axis. "She deserves a better bed." And then he walked down the hallway toward his office and left Maria standing in the east corridor with her hands pressed flat against her thighs and her eyes burning in a way she absolutely refused to permit.
Not yet.
Not here. Later, alone, she would let herself feel it. But first, she had a house to take care of.
She always did.
He didn't say anything else that morning. Maria moved through the rest of her shift waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the formal conversation, for the HR language, for the gentle but firm explanation that this arrangement simply could not continue. She was so prepared for it that she jumped slightly every time she heard footsteps near whatever room she was working in. She rehearsed her responses. She practiced her dignified acceptance. She was very good at dignified acceptance. It was one of the skills life had given her the most opportunity to develop. But Nate Calloway disappeared into his home office and stayed there for 3 hours. When she passed the door, she could hear the low, clipped efficiency of his voice on calls, real calls, work calls, the language of quarterly projections and deployment timelines, and a phrase she kept hearing that she understood meant a very large amount of money moving somewhere. He was running his billion-dollar company. Whatever had happened in the East hallway was apparently a minor parenthesis in the larger document of his day. At 11:30, Sophia woke up. This was the part that always required the most careful choreography. Sophia woke from her morning sleep in stages. First a series of soft sounds that meant she was surfacing, then a period of calm wakefulness during which she would look at her books or talk quietly to Peanut, and then, if her mother had not appeared within approximately 7 minutes of that second stage, a volume escalation that was impressive for someone who weighed 32 pounds. Maria had the internal clock of a mother, which is to say she had a biological alarm system more reliable than any app. She was at the utility room door before Sophia fully opened her eyes, and she scooped her daughter up and held her close and pressed her lips to the top of Sophia's head, those 2 uneven pigtails, always slightly lopsided by mid-morning, and breathed her in for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was about 4 seconds. Mama, Sophia said, with the complete satisfaction of someone whose world was entirely in order. Yes, baby. I'm here. She had a small bag she kept in the utility room. Apple slices in a container, a juice box, 2 crackers, a change of clothes. The necessities of a toddler's portable life. She settled Sophia against her hip and reached for the apple slices, and that was when she realized the utility room door had been pushed further open while Sophia was sleeping. And there was something new in the corner. Where the folded moving blanket had been, there was now a proper child sleeping mat, the kind used in good daycare centers, thick foam with a washable cover in a small pattern of yellow stars. Next to it, a small fleece blanket, still in its packaging, in a soft shade of lavender. And on top of the blanket, tucked with a carefulness that was somehow both practical and tender, was a small stuffed elephant that was not Peanut. This new elephant was gray and soft and had a small yellow ribbon around its neck. It was sitting upright, leaning against the lavender blanket, as if it had always been there and was simply waiting to be discovered. Sophia stared at it from the safety of her mother's arms. "Elephant," she said. It was not a question. It was an identification, delivered with the gravity appropriate to such things. "Yes," Maria managed. Her voice was not as steady as she needed it to be. She knew Nate Calloway had not left the property that morning. She knew this with certainty because she tracked the movements of the household as naturally as breathing, which meant that sometime between 7:30 and 11, in the middle of running his company and taking his calls, Nathaniel Calloway had ordered a sleeping mat and a blanket and a stuffed elephant, had found them somewhere, had arranged for them to appear in a utility room in his own house. For a child he had never spoken to. For a child who was not supposed to be there. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, her daughter on her hip, her composure doing something very precarious. Sophia had already decided. She reached toward the new elephant with the absolute certainty of a 3-year-old who recognizes something as hers. Maria handed it to her. Sophia held the new elephant in one arm and Peanut in the other and considered them both with an expression of profound contentment. 2 elephants, Sophia observed. 2 elephants, Maria confirmed. She had to leave the room for a moment. She told herself it was to get Sophia's juice box from the bag. It was not entirely untrue. Over the next 3 days, Nate Calloway said nothing direct about Sophia's presence in his house. But things kept changing. The utility room, which Maria had started mentally referring to as Sophia's room, with a complicated mixture of gratitude and guilt, acquired a small portable sound machine, the kind that plays white noise and nature sounds. A small basket of board books appeared, titles Maria recognized from the library's best of list, still with their bookstore stickers on. A child-sized folding table materialized, low enough for a 3-year-old to use, with a set of large chunky crayons and a pad of thick drawing paper. None of these things came with any conversation. None were mentioned. They simply appeared, as if the house itself were adjusting. On the 4th day, a Friday, Nate came down for his mid-morning coffee at 9:30, unusual, as he normally stayed in his office until noon on Fridays. Maria was polishing the kitchen island. She noticed him pause in the doorway of the kitchen and look down the east hallway, and she understood before he spoke what he was about to ask. "Is she up?" "She woke up about 20 minutes ago." He poured his coffee. He stood at the counter and looked at his mug for a moment. Then, conversationally, as if this were a completely ordinary thing, "Does she like outside? The garden?" Maria looked at him carefully. "She loves outside." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. "George is doing the roses today. He always does the roses on Fridays. He used to let his grandkids follow him around while he worked." A pause. "I'm just mentioning that." He walked back toward his office. Maria stood in the kitchen for a moment, her polishing cloth in her hand. Then she went to the utility room, picked up her daughter, and walked out to the garden, where George was indeed working on the roses, and who looked up when he saw them coming and smiled in the wide, uncomplicated way of a man who had been waiting for something small and good to come along, and said, "Well, hello there, young lady. Do you want to help me count the red ones?" Sophia looked at Maria for permission. Maria nodded. Sophia handed Peanut to her mother for safekeeping and walked toward the roses with the seriousness of someone who understood that certain jobs required your full attention. From the window of his home office on the second floor, Nathaniel Calloway watched for approximately 45 seconds before returning to his work. But the corner of his mouth had done something. Just briefly. Something it didn't do very often. It was Mrs. Hendricks who finally said the thing out loud. She said it on a Thursday morning in mid-April, standing at the stove with her back to Nate in the completely uninhibited way she had always spoken to him, which was one of the things he valued most about her, and also one of the things that occasionally made him feel 16 years old. "You know what that child asked me yesterday?" Nate looked up from his tablet. "What child?" Mrs. Hendricks gave him a look over her shoulder that communicated, efficiently and without a single word, that she found this performance of confusion entirely unpersuasive. "Sophia, Maria's little one. She came in here while I was doing prep, and she stood right there." She pointed at a spot on the kitchen floor with her spatula, and she looked up at me very seriously and she said, "Do you got bananas?" Nate put his tablet down. I told her yes. She said, "Peanut likes bananas." I said, "I thought Peanut was an elephant."
She said, "He is."
"Elephants like bananas." Mrs. Hendricks paused. I gave her a banana. She broke off a piece and held it in front of the elephant's face for about 30 seconds, and then she ate the piece herself and said, "He's full now." Another pause. "I've been cooking for 40 years, Mr. Calloway. I have never fed an elephant before. I liked it considerably." He was quiet for a moment. "She seems like a good kid." "She is an exceptional kid," Mrs. Hendricks said firmly. "But I wasn't talking about her, actually." "Then what were you talking about?" Mrs. Hendricks turned around. She put the spatula down. She had the kind of face that made lying feel structurally impossible in her presence. "I'm talking about the fact that her mama is killing herself. 6 days a week, starting before sunrise, managing this entire property alone because you let Diane go in February and haven't replaced her, working until 6:30 most evenings, and on top of all of that she's trying to keep a 3-year-old entertained and quiet and invisible while she does it." A pause. "I have watched Maria Elena hold herself together with sheer willpower for 8 months, and I am here to tell you that sheer willpower has a structural limit." Nate was quiet. "I raised 3 children, Mr. Calloway. I know what it looks like when a woman is running on empty and too proud and too good at her job to let anyone see it." She picked the spatula back up. "I am not telling you what to do. I am simply describing a thing I observe because I believe in accurate information." He stood up from the breakfast table. He walked to the window that overlooked the side garden, where he could see, though she didn't know she was visible from here, Maria moving between the topiary hedges with her supply cart, quick and efficient as ever, her shoulders set in that particular way she had, upright and forward, the posture of a person pushing against something invisible and very heavy. "What would help her?" he asked. Not out loud. He thought he hadn't said it out loud. "Ask her," Mrs. Hendricks said, from the stove, without turning around. Revolutionary technique. Works almost every time. He had not been good at asking. That was the honest truth of it, and it was the kind of truth he had more access to in the early morning, before the day's demands built their usual scaffolding around him. He had grown up as the only child of 2 people who expressed love primarily through achievement, good grades celebrated, disappointments quietly managed, emotional needs treated as engineering problems to be optimized away. He had graduated to a professional world where directness meant numbers and outcomes and quarterly reports, where the language of feeling was mostly decorative, something you did briefly and well in all-hands meetings before returning to the metrics that actually mattered. He was very good at solving large problems. He was genuinely, earnestly terrible at solving the kind that required him to walk up to another person and simply say, "I see that you're struggling. What do you need?" He had been trying, in the only language that came naturally to him, action arrangement, the quiet procurement of sleeping mats and board books and stuffed elephants, to say something he didn't have the words for yet. He went looking for Maria that afternoon. He found her in the library, on a stepladder, working on the upper shelves. She came down the ladder when she heard him, automatically moving toward a more formal posture, the professional distance she maintained with him always, and he put up a hand, just barely, just slightly, and said, "Don't."
Please.
"I'm not," he stopped. "Try it again." "I just wanted to talk for a minute." She waited, her hands folded in front of her in the way they did when she was being very controlled. "I'm going to hire another housekeeper," he said.
Full-time.
"To take on part of your load. The job posting goes up tomorrow, and until that person is hired, I'm cutting your days from 6 to 5 and your hours from—" He had done the math, he had actually looked at her hours, "from 11 hours to 8. Same pay. No discussion." She opened her mouth. "Same pay," he repeated. "Non-negotiable. Consider it a correction to a staffing oversight." She closed her mouth. Something moved behind her eyes that she quickly brought under control. "The room off the east wing," he said. "I'd like to have it painted this week. There's a crew coming Thursday. Sophia should have some input on the color, I think." Since he stopped. He was not good at this part. He pushed through it. "Since it's her room. While she's here." "Mr. Calloway." "Nate." It came out before he planned it. "You've worked in my house for 8 months. Please call me Nate." A pause. Long enough to be significant. "Nate," she said. She said it carefully, like handling something fragile. Then, "You didn't have to do any of this." "I know that," he said. "It's my responsibility. Sophia is She's 3 years old," he said. "And she was sleeping on moving blankets."
He stopped.
He realized his voice had done something slightly unsteady, and he worked to correct it. "Nobody should have to solve the problem you were solving alone. That's all I'm saying." "Okay." Maria was quiet for a long moment. Her hands had changed their posture slightly, no longer folded, one hand now resting over the other, a less guarded configuration. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay," he said. He started to leave. He turned back because there was one more thing, the thing that was actually the real thing, the thing underneath all the practical things. "She's incredible, by the way. Sophia." He said it to the door frame slightly more than to Maria, because it was easier that way. "I watched her spend 25 minutes in the garden last Tuesday trying to convince George that one of the garden gnomes was lonely and needed a friend. She had a whole argument. With evidence." A pause. "George is ordering another gnome." And then he left the library quickly, before he had to see whatever Maria's face was doing. Because he was relatively certain that whatever it was doing would undo him completely. And he had a 4 o'clock call with Tokyo. The room off the east wing was painted on a Thursday. Sophia's input on the color had been solicited the previous Saturday, which was the day Maria brought her into the main house for the first time, not through the side entrance, but through the front door, because Nate had suggested it with the careful casualness of someone suggesting a very small and completely unimportant thing. Maria had dressed Sophia in her best dress, pale yellow with a small white collar, and redone her pigtails 3 times until they were as even as they were ever going to be. Sophia had carried both elephants, one under each arm, because she had decided they went everywhere together now. They were a family. She had walked into the front hall of Ravenswood Drive and stopped. She looked up. The ceiling in the front hall was 22 feet high, with a chandelier that caught the morning light and broke it into fragments that drifted across the walls. Sophia tracked these light fragments with the focused intensity of a scientist.
Stars, she said.
It is like stars, Maria agreed. Nate was at the foot of the staircase. He had clearly positioned himself there with some intent, because he had a paint sample booklet in his hand and a look on his face that Maria had privately begun to identify as his trying to seem casual about something he cares about look, which involved his jaw being slightly too relaxed and his posture slightly too still. He crouched down to Sophia's level. This was, Maria realized later, such a simple thing. Such a small physical act. A grown man bending his knees, so he was not towering over a child, and yet it cracked something open in her chest in a way she hadn't expected.
Hi, he said.
You must be Sophia. Sophia regarded him with the frank, unhurried assessment that 3-year-olds apply to new people. You're very tall, she said. I am, he agreed. I'm Nate. Nate, she repeated, testing it. Then, satisfied, I have 2 elephants. I see that. Are they brothers? They're a family, Sophia said, in the tone of someone correcting an understandable but significant error. This one's Peanut. She held up the original elephant. This one's Peanut's daddy. She held up the newer one. Something in Nate's expression shifted, very briefly and very privately. That's a good name, he said. He expert on colors, and would she look through and tell him what she thought? Sophia took this responsibility with appropriate gravity. She sat down on the marble floor of the front hall, just sat right down, the way children do, without ceremony, and opened the booklet in her lap and paged through it with both elephants propped against her knees. She chose yellow. Specifically, a shade called Morning Finch, which was a warm, clear yellow, the color of butter and sunshine, and the inside of a daffodil. She pointed to it with one finger and said, "This one," with the decisiveness of someone who has given the matter full consideration. "Yellow it is," Nate said. He stood up. He met Maria's eyes over Sophia's head. And for a moment, just a moment, unguarded and unplanned, a moment neither of them had scripted or prepared for, they simply looked at each other. Not as employer and employee. Not as 2 people on opposite ends of an economic universe. As 2 people standing in a hallway watching a child choose a paint color with complete and absolute sincerity, both of them feeling something they hadn't expected to feel. Maria looked away first, because she had to. By the following Thursday, the room was yellow. Morning Finch, precisely. The crew had done the trim in bright white and installed a new set of low shelving along one wall, the kind that was just the right height for a 3-year-old to reach. Mrs. Hendricks had contributed a small rug she described as sitting in storage taking up space, which was patterned with flowers and was clearly not something that had been sitting anywhere in storage, but was in fact quite new and carefully chosen. George had added a small potted plant, a succulent, because George held firm opinions about appropriate plants for young children, and succulents were hardy enough to survive love. Paolo had quietly installed a small Bluetooth speaker shaped like a mushroom that connected to a playlist he had curated, which included Wheels on the Bus, but also, because Paolo had principles, some very gentle classic jazz. Sophia had walked in, looked around, identified each thing in the room, walked to the bookshelf, lined up her elephants on the second lowest shelf where she could see them, and then turned around and said, to the room in general, with quiet finality, "Good." And then she sat down on her mat and opened a book. That was the afternoon Maria Elena Vasquez cried. Not in the room. Not in front of her daughter. She excused herself and walked to the small bathroom at the end of the east corridor and sat on the edge of the tub and let herself, very quietly, for about 3 minutes, come undone. Because she had spent 3 years building a life on pure will and love and the refusal to fail, and for 3 years she had managed it, and it had been good. It had been enough, but there was a particular kind of exhaustion that she only fully felt when someone helped. When someone held out a hand and your body finally registered, only then, how long you had been holding everything up alone. She pressed her hands to her face. She breathed through it. She thought about her mother, coming home at midnight smelling of industrial lemon cleaner, and she understood something about her mother that she had always known but now felt in her actual bones. She thought about a man crouching down to her daughter's level and asking about the elephants. She thought about Morning Finch. She breathed out. She pressed the backs of her hands to her eyes. She stood up, checked her face in the mirror, made the necessary corrections, and walked back out to where her daughter was reading and the room was yellow and the small mushroom speaker was playing something soft and true. She sat down on the mat next to Sophia. Sophia leaned against her without looking up from her book, the automatic physical trust of a child who has never once doubted that her mother will be there. "Mama," Sophia said. "Yes, baby. This is a good room." "Yes," Maria said. "It is." Outside the window, the California afternoon was doing something beautiful with the light. The thing about pivot points is that you rarely understand them as they're happening. You understand them later, in the retrospective light of a life that has been quietly but permanently altered, when you can trace the line from a single moment backward to all the things it changed. Nate would think about this sometimes. In the years that followed the March morning when he pushed open a utility room door and found Sophia, and he would identify that moment not as the end of anything or the beginning of anything too dramatic, but simply as the morning he stopped sleepwalking through his own life. He had not known that was what he was doing. He had a company. He had wealth that still felt abstract in the way of very large numbers. He had a calendar so full it sometimes seemed like a form of architecture, holding up a version of himself that existed primarily in conference rooms and on earnings calls. He had George and Mrs. Hendricks and Paolo and the garden and the beautiful, enormous, impeccably maintained house that he walked through every morning in old sweatpants, not entirely sure what he was looking for. He had not known he was looking, but he was. The months that followed Sophia's yellow room were not cinematic. They were small and real and irreversible in the way that real things are. Nate hired a second housekeeper, a quiet, capable woman named Deborah, which meant Maria's hours normalized to something sustainable. He stopped calling Maria the housekeeper in his internal monologue and started calling her simply Maria, which sounds like a small thing and was not. He began being present in his house in a slightly different way, less passing through and more arriving, less disappearing into the office and more occasionally pausing at the window to watch George teach Sophia the names of plants. Sophia, for her part, absorbed Ravenswood Drive with the uncomplicated adaptability of a 3-year-old. She reorganized her elephant shelf configuration approximately every other week. She had extensive ongoing diplomatic negotiations with the garden gnomes. She had decided that Mrs. Hendricks was an important person and showed this by occasionally walking into the kitchen and standing next to her while she cooked, not asking for anything, just providing what Sophia clearly believed was supervisory presence. She called Paolo the music man because of the mushroom speaker, and he accepted this title without comment and began curating her playlist with increasing intentionality. She called Nate Nate. Never anything else. She had heard her mother use the name and had simply adopted it with the same authority with which she'd adopted Peanut's father into the family. Nate accepted this without discussion. What Nate was less prepared for was what happened to him in Sophia's company. He had no experience with children.
None.
His friends were largely childless or had children who existed as abstract mentions in conversation, birthday cards he sent through an assistant, photographs on social media that he liked without feeling. He had never knelt on a garden path while a 3-year-old explained the gnome situation with the full scaffolding of her logic and felt, somewhere under his sternum, something loosen. He did now. He started keeping roughly an hour free on Monday and Friday afternoons, which was when Sophia was most often in the main part of the house. He told himself, initially, that this was coincidental. He stopped telling himself that sometime in May, when he found himself rearranging a video call with a London office specifically, so he could be in the garden at the time Sophia was likely to be there. There was a Tuesday in June that he would carry with him for a long time. Sophia had commandeered a corner of the east sitting room. She had a talent for commandeering corners and set up what she called the hospital, which was a medical facility that served the stuffed elephant population. Peanut was ill. Peanut's father was, according to Sophia, the doctor. There was a complex treatment plan that seemed to involve a great deal of blanket arranging and one of Mrs. Hendricks's wooden spoons, which was functioning as a thermometer. Nate had walked past the sitting room door and stopped. He stood in the hallway for a moment, watching through the doorway. Then he walked in and sat on the floor. Sophia looked at him. "I'm not sick," he clarified. "I just wanted to watch." She considered this. "You can be a patient," she said, "but you have to sit still." "I can do that." He sat still. For 37 minutes, by his watch, he sat on the sitting room floor while a 3-year-old ran a stuffed elephant hospital. He was checked with the thermometer spoon twice. He was prescribed, on the second occasion, more naps. Sophia delivered this diagnosis with complete professionalism. He had not laughed that easily, that freely in a long time. He wasn't certain he had laughed quite that way in years. Maria had appeared in the doorway 15 minutes into this. She had looked at the scene, her boss, the billionaire, cross-legged on a sitting room floor being treated with a wooden spoon by her daughter, and her face had done the complicated, beautiful thing it did when she was feeling something she was still learning to let herself feel. She had not said anything. She had leaned against the doorframe and watched. When Nate looked up and saw her, he didn't say anything either. But he smiled. Not his public smile, the one that appeared in Forbes photos and on stage at conferences, the smile of a man performing confidence for an audience. The other one, the quiet, actual one that wasn't performing anything. She smiled back. It was, by any objective measure, a very small moment. By every other measure, it was not small at all. It took them another 3 months. 3 months of accidental proximity and deliberate avoidance, and the particular complicated dance of two people who are both very aware that they have entered territory that is warmer and more significant than they planned, before Nate found the courage to say anything real. He said it badly. He was standing in the kitchen at 7:15 in the morning in his old sweatpants, and he said something about dinner that came out as a grammatically incomplete sentence, and Maria waited patiently while he reassembled it, and then she said quietly, "I would like that." Yes. They had dinner. Then other dinners. Then slowly, with a care that was proportionate to the importance of what they were handling, something that was not any longer just dinners. Sophia, for her part, was entirely unsurprised by all of it. Children understand things that adults spend enormous energy obscuring from themselves. On a Sunday in October, Nate and Maria sat on the back patio while Sophia ran in circles in the garden for reasons she had not explained and did not appear to need to. The California evening was the color of something a painter might spend years trying to reproduce. Mrs. Hendricks had left a plate of something wonderful on the table. George's roses were doing their best work of the season. "She calls this her garden now," Maria said. Not as a complaint, just as an observation about a truth. "It is her garden," Nate said. Maria was quiet for a moment. Nate, I want you to know something. She said it carefully, the way she did when she meant something very much. I came to this house 8 months ago with nothing but a plan that was barely holding together. And every day I came here, and I was so scared and so proud and so determined not to let anyone see that I was both of those things at once. She paused. And you saw. He looked at her. You saw, and you didn't make it about pity. You didn't make me feel small. You just, she stopped. Started again. You made room. You deserved room, he said. In the garden. Sophia had stopped running and was now in a very serious conversation with the oldest garden gnome. She was gesturing with both hands. Peanut and his father were arranged on the nearby garden wall, observing proceedings. What is she telling him? Nate asked. Maria watched her daughter for a moment. Probably about the new gnome who just arrived. She's been very invested in the social dynamics. George ordered a third one, Nate said. It should arrive Tuesday. Of course it should. Maria shook her head. There was laughter in it. They sat in the evening light. Sophia negotiated gnome politics. The roses moved slightly in the late breeze. Inside, Mrs. Hendricks was doing something with butter that would probably be extraordinary.